He never planned on becoming their guardian. He just wanted peace. Solitude. But when two wild souls arrived at his doorstep, orphaned and alone, something inside him shifted. A lynx, cold-eyed and silent. A bobcat, restless and wild. He didn't cage them. Didn't tame them. He simply gave them what the world wouldn't. Time. Space. Trust. And they stayed. Not because they had to, but because something unspoken held them together. Until the world came knocking. With fences. With rules. With fear. Years passed. Bonds deepened. But wildness doesn't sleep forever. What they did in the end shattered everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and letting go. Before we start, if stories of quiet loyalty, wild bonds, and the kind of love that doesn't ask for anything in return move you, consider subscribing. We share true, cinematic stories of animals and the humans forever changed by them. And sometimes, those stories stay with you long after the screen goes dark. The land stretched for miles without interruption, hemmed in by low fences and long-forgotten property lines. This part of Maine didn't ask much from the world, just silence and distance. That morning, silence blanketed everything in white. Jonah Holloway had lived in this part of the country for 13 years. A former wildlife biologist who'd stopped writing papers when he realized the wild didn't need citations, it needed guardians. His home wasn't picturesque. It was practical. A single-story wooden structure tucked beneath a thicket of pine and birch. His closest neighbors were 6 miles away. And that was exactly how he liked it. The snow had fallen gently overnight. By the time Jonah opened his front door just after dawn, it came up past his boots. The air had that stillness only winter could command. He stepped out with a cup of black coffee, squinting at the distant tree line. And then he saw them. 2 figures, low to the ground, cautious but steady, emerged from the shadowed birch grove. His breath caught in his throat before he could even think. A lynx and a bobcat moving together. Not fighting. Not pacing. Just walking. Side by side. In sync. It wasn't unheard of for the two species to overlap in these parts. But to see them together, like this, in harmony? That wasn't natural. Not in the scientific sense, anyway. They were older, larger than any juveniles he'd documented in the wild. The lynx moved with grace, paws barely making a sound in the snow. The bobcat, stockier and more deliberate, paused occasionally to sniff the air, like he was trying to remember something. They weren't afraid. If anything, they looked familiar. Jonah stood frozen as they approached, not fast, but with purpose. The lynx tilted its head, and something in its eyes made Jonah's heart beat faster. He stepped back inside and quietly closed the door, hands trembling. He knew those eyes. 2 years earlier, Jonah never sought to become a caretaker. In fact, he'd left that life behind in Colorado after a grueling 7-year career of field rescues, government red tape, and the slow burn of compassion fatigue. He'd come to Maine to disappear, to take care of land and keep to himself. But life, as he learned over and over, does not respect retirement. It started with the wildfire. Not in Maine, but in the Quebec backcountry. A massive blaze that burned uncontrolled for 8 days, displacing everything in its path. The call came not from the agency, but from an old friend. "We found 2 survivors. Young. Alone. They won't make it through transport. We need someone close to the border, someone we trust." Jonah didn't say yes out loud. He just sent the coordinates. They arrived the next night in the back of an unmarked conservation truck. Wrapped in burlap, both barely breathing. A lynx kitten, dehydrated and glassy-eyed. And a smaller bobcat, curled around the lynx like a shield. Jonah didn't ask how they'd been found together. He just responded to what he saw. It wasn't easy. The lynx, who he later named Oren, wouldn't eat for 3 days. The bobcat, Mika, was aggressive at first, swiping at anything that came close. But neither would sleep unless the other was beside them. As Jonah tended to their wounds, fed them by hand, and rearranged half his cabin to make space for a secure enclosure. He told himself this was temporary. 3 months turned into 6. The first time Oren climbed onto Jonah's lap, the lynx's weight felt like a silent decision. Mika wasn't far behind. She would sit near the window for hours, watching snow fall, flicking her tail just slightly, like she was calculating something. They weren't pets. They were survivors. And he was just their steward. But some nights, when the wind howled across the frozen fields and the world seemed to shrink to just their little wooden home, Jonah began to wonder if they were keeping him alive, too. He never put them on social media. Never allowed visitors. The more the world buzzed and posted and tagged, the more Jonah retreated into silence. He knew what it meant to offer sanctuary, and what it cost. But they were never meant to stay. By their second year, Oren had reached full maturity. His fur was thick, silver-tipped, and regal. Mika, ever leaner, had a more muscular frame now, her movements more precise. They'd stopped needing Jonah, but they didn't stop loving him. It was different. They would brush past him when he stepped outside, sometimes wait by the shed when he brought food, but they no longer sat by the fire with him. No longer looked to him with that softness of dependency. They were growing into something the wild had designed them to be. And then one morning they were gone. No broken fence. No trail of panic. Just gone. Jonah searched the property for 3 straight days. No prints, no scat, no sign of distress. He kept telling himself this was good. This was what he'd prepared them for. But the quiet in the house felt like a punishment. Now, 2 years later, they were back. Oren reached the porch first. Mika stayed behind, eyes locked on the door. Jonah slowly opened it, unsure what would happen. They didn't lunge. They didn't growl. They didn't even try to enter. Oren sat on the porch, looking up at him. Mika let out a low, guttural trill, a sound he hadn't heard since she was young. It was almost like a greeting. And in that moment, he noticed something in Mika's posture. She wasn't here to stay. Jonah's throat tightened. They had come back, for a reason. But not to return. They were here to show him something. Or say goodbye. And as Jonah stepped outside into the bitter air, unsure whether to reach out or stand back, a deeper, quieter realization set in. Something was wrong. And whatever it was going to change everything. By the time the second winter had arrived since Elias brought Luma and Bristle into his secluded mountain cabin, the snow no longer startled them. The lynx would sit calmly by the frost-rimmed windowpane, her tufted ears twitching faintly at the sound of wind against the wood, while Bristle, more restless, paced the perimeter of the living room like a silent guard. They had grown into powerful creatures, sleek, feral, and breathtaking. But more than that, they had become something harder to define. Not pets. Not quite wild. Not human companions either. Something else. Something in between. It was always silent in the mornings, until it wasn't. A bird's cry, the thud of snow from a rooftop, the sound of Luma's breath fogging the glass. Elias began noticing it more, the change. Small things at first. Luma no longer came to greet him when he opened the cabin door. Bristle started vanishing for hours into the forest, his paws leaving solitary trails in the white. Elias would sit in his worn flannel at the edge of the porch, his breath visible in the cold, coffee cooling in his hands. He loved them. He wasn't ashamed to say that aloud anymore. But he also knew what the silence meant. Nature doesn't ask permission to reclaim her own. And for all the warmth, all the years under one roof, the wild had begun whispering again to Luma and Bristle. One night, as Elias worked on res-tacking wood near the cabin's edge, he heard a sound that turned his blood cold. Not a howl, not a shriek, just the absence of everything. He dropped the logs, his hands scraped and trembling, and ran into the woods with only a flashlight and a frantic voice calling out, "Luma! Bristle!" What he found wasn't blood. It was worse. Tracks. Strange ones. Boot prints. Deep. Recent. And beside them, dragged marks in the snow. He followed them until they vanished near the ridge, where the drop was too steep for him to cross. Breathless, he returned home, only to find Luma pacing outside the cabin like a shadow. Tail rigid, eyes shining with something he had never seen in her before, fear. Bristle was gone. Elias didn't sleep that night. Luma didn't move from the front door, ears trained on the dark. At dawn, Elias loaded his pack, slung the rifle over his shoulder, not to shoot, just to scare, and headed into the wilderness. It wasn't just the fear of poachers that gripped him. It was the guilt. Bristle had changed in recent weeks. He had begun staying away longer, even sleeping outside. Was he trying to leave? Had Elias refused to see the signs? Guilt follows you louder than footsteps in snow. Day after day, Elias combed the woods. Luma stayed close, her movements sharper now, primal. She no longer brushed against his legs or purred when he whispered her name. Something in her had shifted, some protective instinct, perhaps, or grief. On the 6th day, they found a camp. It was buried, clearly abandoned in haste. A torn tarp, burnt wood, animal hair, and zip ties. The sickness in Elias's gut turned to rage. He didn't know who had taken Bristle, but whoever they were, they had no idea what they were dealing with. Bristle wasn't just a bobcat. He was raised like a shadow in a home that had loved him. He knew the difference between safety and danger. And he would fight. But it was Luma who caught the scent first. She froze near a pine, lowered her body, and gave a low, guttural hiss Elias had never heard before. Her eyes narrowed. Her muscles coiled like a bowstring. And then she bolted. Elias had no choice but to follow, lungs burning, heart screaming. He stumbled over roots, slipped across ice, and still ran faster than he ever had in his life. Until he reached a clearing, and saw it. A rusted trapper's truck. Doors open. Cages. And Bristle, bloody but alive, inside one of them, backed against the bars, his fur bristled, growling low. The moment Luma reached the cage, she didn't make a sound. She just sat in front of it, nose touching the bars. Bristle leaned forward and pressed his head against hers. Elias didn't remember moving. Didn't remember what words came from his mouth or what sounds echoed through the trees. Only that the door to the cage was open, and Bristle crawled out, collapsing against Elias's chest like a broken weight. But just as Elias turned to leave with both of them beside him, a voice rang out behind the truck. Low. Cold. You shouldn't be here. Elias turned, heart pounding. 2 men. One holding a long metal rod, the other a knife sheathed at his hip. They weren't there to explain. They weren't sorry. And Elias had walked into their trap. Luma stepped forward, placing herself between Elias and the strangers, her muscles rippling under her coat. Then silence. No one moved. The cold seeped in. A gust blew dead leaves into the air. Elias could feel it, the moment something ancient stirred in the 2 animals he had raised. They weren't pets anymore. They weren't his. Not in this moment. And that terrified him. Don't, he whispered to Luma, his voice breaking. Please! But Luma turned her head once, just once, and looked at him. Not with defiance. Not with anger. But with a goodbye. She leapt. And in that second, everything changed. By the end of autumn, the routines had changed. Ezra had let go of the idea that he was their protector. Now, it was the Lynx and Bobcat who stood watch. They no longer needed him in the same way, and in truth, he no longer knew if he needed them, or if he had simply grown addicted to the way their presence filled the silence. He tried to work again. Tried to return to woodworking, to his craft, to the rhythm that had once kept him whole. But the wood felt alien beneath his hands. It was as if, somewhere between the years of raising them and now, his soul had been rewired. Ash and Lark became less dependent. They spent longer and longer hours in the forested ravine just beyond the valley. When they returned, their coats were coated with bramble, their muscles tighter, more defined, their eyes glowing with an alertness Ezra hadn't seen since their wild days. And then one morning, they didn't return. It was a quiet ache at first. He waited, boiling eggs, watching the trail from the kitchen window. But when night came and the steps didn't echo against the deck, he stood outside beneath the cold stars, whispering their names into the trees. No answer. No sound. Just the hush of the forest reclaiming what had always been hers. Ezra didn't sleep that night. He searched the next day. And the one after that. Called to the neighbors. Left scraps in the clearing. Even set up the old trail camera he once used for deer. Nothing. 3 weeks passed. He stopped looking. People lose things. Sometimes even the things they love most. But love is strange. When it runs deep enough, it doesn't obey time. Or distance. It just lingers. Like a thread pulled taut between souls. It was February when he saw the news report. Unusual predator behavior outside of Lakeview suburb. Lynx and Bobcat pair caught on security footage. No aggression reported. One appears to be injured. The footage was grainy. But Ezra knew. The lynx limped on his right side. The bobcat hung behind, guarding his flank. It was them. Lark and Ash. No doubt in his mind. The way they moved, like dancers tethered by invisible string. Together. Always. Lakeview was nearly 40 miles away. Ezra drove through the night. When he got there, the snow was already melting. The air held the scent of thawing earth and car exhaust. The security footage had gone viral. People were debating online whether the animals were too friendly. Some even accusing local wildlife services of releasing trained hybrids. Ezra knew better. He reached out to animal control, offering insight. They dismissed him, until he showed them photos, vet bills, and the adoption records from years ago. A truce was formed. Together, they planned a quiet approach. When they finally found them, it wasn't in a backyard or suburban street. It was in the ruins of a burnt-down cabin at the edge of the industrial zone. A place no human dared walk after dark. But they had made it a sanctuary. Lark lay curled beneath a fallen beam, his shoulder raw and infected. Ash stood above him, her body low, ears pinned, fangs bared at the approaching rescue team. Ezra stepped forward before the tranquilizers were drawn. He didn't speak. He just crouched down, eyes locked with Ash's, breath even. Recognition came slow, but it came. A low whimper escaped her throat. A flicker of disbelief in her golden eyes. Then she bolted toward him. Lark followed, limping, struggling, but when he saw Ezra, he let out a sound Ezra had never heard before. Not quite a growl. Not a meow. Something between grief and gratitude. Ezra didn't flinch. He opened his arms. And they came to him, like no years had passed. The rescue was complicated. Wildlife law had changed since the last time Ezra had taken them in. Rewilding programs were stricter. And with Lark injured and Ash deemed overly human-friendly, the officials were split. One proposal: move them to a sanctuary. Keep them caged. Safe. Another: relocate them deep into the wild. No more human contact. Ezra knew what he wanted. But he didn't speak for them anymore. He couldn't. Instead, he sat in the vet's office with Lark lying sedated on a blanket beside him, Ash pacing restlessly. And he asked himself the hardest question of all. What if love means letting go again? They were no longer the creatures he raised. No longer orphans. They had become something else, fiercely wild and yet somehow still tethered to him. In the end, it was the animals who decided. After Lark recovered, they began to grow restless. Ezra watched as they paced the fences of the temporary enclosure, not with panic, but with memory. As if they knew that beyond those bars the world still called. The final morning, he opened the gate. No words. No ceremony. Ash stepped out first. Lark followed. They didn't look back. But 3 weeks later, just as spring began to stretch its arms across the valley, Ezra woke to a sound outside. A quiet paw step. 2 shapes on the hill. Watching. And then, they vanished into the trees again. He wept. Not from sadness, but from knowing they still remembered. That they had found him, even now. That love, in its truest form, needs no cages. No chains. Just time. And the willingness to let go. Even if it breaks you. The seasons turned again. Snow thinned into rain. Rain warmed into sun. The earth stretched, bloomed, and pulsed with a rhythm Ezra no longer resisted. Life without them, Ash and Lark, had become a quieter thing. Not empty, just rearranged. Like a home after a long visit. You still find the shadows of where things used to be. But they were not gone. Not entirely. Every few weeks, there would be signs. A scrape on the porch railing. Feathers left in a perfect circle on the back step. Once, a tuft of russet fur snagged on the apple tree's lowest branch. Ezra never spoke of it to the neighbors. They had their own lives, gardeners and goat keepers, people who glanced at the woods but didn't listen to it. But he listened. Every sound in the night, every shift in the trees, every sudden silence, it all spoke to him like a second language. Ash and Lark were alive. Still close. And they were watching. The change came in late August. A fire started in the north. It was lightning, they said. A dry storm that struck without rain. The kind of thing that used to happen once a decade, but now came every summer. It moved fast. Within 2 days the blaze had eaten 40,000 acres of forest. By the third day, Ezra's valley filled with smoke. Not thick enough to evacuate, but enough that the sky turned strange, a color between copper and bruised lavender. He sat on the porch, eyes watering, the world around him filtered through haze. That night they came. Ash first. She appeared at the edge of the field like a phantom carved from the smoke. Her shoulders low, ears flicking with tension. She looked thinner. Her fur singed in places. Lark followed, slower. He was limping again. His old injury flared, likely from running through broken ground. Ezra didn't speak. He just opened the gate. They crossed the field like ghosts returning to the only place they remembered as safe. He cleared out the old root cellar beneath the barn. Made space. Laid towels and straw. Bowls of water. Cooked the last of the venison in his freezer. He told himself it was temporary. That they just needed shelter. But deep down, he knew. The fire was bigger than anyone admitted. And the animals, deer, coyotes, even bears, had begun drifting through human land like smoke itself. Ash and Lark weren't just escaping danger. They were seeking something they remembered, a home that had once held them when they were too young to fend for themselves. Now, it was his turn to protect them again. But safety, Ezra knew, had a cost. By the end of the week, the media had caught on. Large feline sightings increased near rural properties. Lynx and Bobcat may be displaced by fire. Photos surfaced. One from a trail camera just 2 miles from Ezra's house. The Wildlife Department issued warnings. One official interview ended with the words, "If located, these animals will be sedated and relocated to an appropriate facility. Human habituation poses risks, for both animal and public." Ezra felt it like a knife. He'd spent years making sure Ash and Lark were free to leave, to live, to return. But now their closeness, their trust, was a danger. And this time, it wasn't just theory. A neighbor reported damage to their chicken coop. No deaths, just the wire fencing torn open. Another neighbor found claw marks on their shed. Ezra knew they didn't do it. Ash and Lark had never attacked a single animal in their care. Not once. But that didn't matter now. In stories like these, fear always writes the ending. The raid happened before dawn. Ezra had just risen, kettle whistling, when the gravel crackled outside. White trucks. 2 unmarked vans. Dart rifles. He ran. Not toward them, but toward the barn. They were already outside. Alert. Ash growling low, eyes scanning the wind. Lark behind her, panting. He didn't shout. Didn't panic. He just knelt down and whispered the words he'd always used when storms came. "It's okay. Stay close. I'm here." But it wasn't okay. One of the officers rounded the side, dart already raised. Ezra moved in front of them. "This is private property," he said. "We have legal clearance," came the response. "They've never hurt anyone. They're still wild. And they're not yours anymore." The words struck like thunder. Not yours. As if love had rules. As if wildness could be severed like a leash. Ash growled louder. Lark took a step forward. And the dart flew. Ezra lunged, but not fast enough. It hit Lark in the shoulder. Ash let out a sound like shattering glass. She turned, crouched, and leapt toward the man with the rifle. Not to kill. Just to stop him. The second dart struck her midair. She collapsed beside Lark, paws twitching. The air fell silent. Ezra dropped to his knees. Not in rage. Not in protest. But in grief. He placed a hand on each of them, their chests rising slower now, their breaths shallow. "They were only trying to come home," he whispered. "They took them away in metal crates. Didn't say where. Didn't say for how long." Ezra stood in the field long after the trucks disappeared. Smoke still hung in the sky. The forest still burned somewhere far behind the hills. But the fire inside him was worse. He had let them go once before. Out of love. Out of trust. But this wasn't like that. This was theft. He didn't sleep that night. Or the next. He started writing letters. Emails. News posts. Calling journalists. Pleading with wildlife officials. Offering to fund rehabilitation programs. Sanctuary options. Anything. Weeks passed. No reply. Until, one day, a single letter arrived. From a sanctuary 3 states north. It read, "They are safe. Together. Recovering. You may visit, on one condition: you cannot touch them. They are not pets. They must learn to forget your scent." Ezra held the letter for a long time. Then folded it once. And set it in the drawer beside the porch.